Great. Well, we want to welcome everybody to our May Think Tank call. And we're pretty excited about today and all that's going to go on in the conversation that's here. Want to give a shout out real quick at the top to Peterson, who's on the call. Many of you were part of an event that Jeremy had a big role in putting on in Colorado last week for executive pastors. And so, Jeremy, kudos to you at the top of the call for doing such a great job with that and all that it goes in pulling that together. And so some of you guys have actually found this call through being at that event. So we're grateful to Jeremy as well for the bridge that allows us to provide some resources here. As we say it every time as we start recording, that this call will get sent out. And so today we will send the recording of the call, and when Steve will have some important information to present to us that you will also get in a format that he has that you guys will get post call. I want to give a chance for
So
us to
strange.
talk
Just a
about.
second. I just opened a fresh.
Someone is not muted, so that's fun. So thank you. Can get really awkward. I wanted to give a chance before we introduce Steve, because some of you guys, we get to the end of the call and everybody, people have to go to lunch or whatever time zone you're in. I think Kay can put it up. We are today really pushing out our Gromentum event that we do every October here in Las Vegas. And because you're on the call, we're going to give you about 48 hours to take advantage of the discount code as Jeremiah puffs away on his cigar for the event in Vegas. The reason we wanted to start today with promoting it is because Steve is going to be a major part of that. We have a couple other individuals that will be also part of our content day, but we are really looking forward to this intimate but impactful couple days in Vegas. If you haven't been, we really try to do a combination of spiritual replenishment, personal replenishment, and content that will hopefully really resource you. And so we wanted to give you a chance, because you're on this call today, to be able to go to the link. Kay, is it like a 48-hour window before that expires-ish?
Uh, yes.
Great.
Yeah, till the end of the weekend.
Yeah. Some clarity. Event starts on Wednesday night with what we're going to have a connection and communion dinner. We've changed up a little bit. Some real time to just kind of connect. All day Thursday. Friday is our replenishment day, golf, Vegas, whatever you want to do. And Thursday night, we will do a really nice, classy, spoil you like crazy dinner. Last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to hand it off, is this event is specifically designed for lead pastors and I'll say executive level leadership. So this is not an event that's designed for staff wide. It's really designed for you. If you're an executive guy and you're a lead guy, or if you're an executive team, it would be appropriate. These are people at the table making decisions in leadership that we really kind of cater to. And so we're going to have Steve with us. We're going to have James Robinson from Brooklyn, who's going to be with us. We're pretty excited about that representing. And then we have some young leaders that we're going to hear from, because we want to get some perspective on how do we manage and empower and develop emerging leaders all together in this event. So sign up. It's live now. And so you can make that happen and take advantage of a little bit of a discount. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay. Anything to add to that I didn't say? Kay will be there. So those of you that love Kay, he will be there like Taylor. And so you can come and be with Kay. Hey, we're really excited to have Steve with us today. And so, each time we get on these calls, we really try to bring a combination of probably what we would call a webinar, where we share great resourcing, great content, but also some opportunity for us to interact. And so today our plan is to have Steve start to dive in to an area that I think is really, really important for all of us to process and hear wherever we're at in this journey of leadership within the church space. And then I know that Steve will share for half of our time and then have some time at the end. Our team will be in the chat. So even as Steve is talking and sharing, if you have questions that come up, put them in the chat. And Steve, we may interrupt you a couple times if the question's really pertinent and have you deal with it there, but we'll also have some Q&A at the end. Okay. All right, Steve, appreciate you being here, bud. I'm gonna mute. Take us away.
Great. Lee, thanks so much. Kay, you too. It was a pleasure to meet you guys earlier, and just yeah, it's an honor to be with everybody. I'm just going to take 15 or 20 minutes to kind of introduce us to a way of being that I think has tremendous long-term health. And let me just start with a bang. I think regardless of your role in the church, doesn't matter what your role is, if you're on staff at a church, I think the best asset that you have to offer your people, and actually the best asset you have to offer the kingdom of God, is a well self, a well self. Now, when you hear that right away, like some of you know me, some of you don't know me and all, that might be very alarming to you that I didn't even mention Jesus. That sounds almost heretical. Like, look, we're in ministry to proclaim Christ and help people follow Christ. That's great. If you and I were playing poker and I raised you well self and then you kind of raised me Jesus, I would push all my chips back in on well self. This is a recorded Zoom, so I'm not going to name names, but I bet you and I could make a long list of Christian leaders since, say, 2017, just the last 7 years, Christian leaders who were proclaiming Jesus while they themselves were not well. It's an unmitigated disaster. It's doing colossal damage in the church. I don't know what it's like when visitors come to your church, but we have some of the guests that come to our church now way more cagey about church leadership because of these guys who are not well. So rather than that path, that is now a well-trod cliche of a path of leaders that are not well and not aware of it and not dealing with it. I think instead, being well, because when you are well, and that is actually a specific thing, it's not some general thing, then people can see Christ in you, the actual true living Christ, not some distorted version. I learned this the hard way myself when I was a hospital chaplain. After I graduated from Bible college, this is back in the 1990s. I served as a trauma and hospice chaplain for a year, and I just had no idea of everything that was going on under the surface in my life. And when you're not aware of what's going on, whether it's what you're carrying or what's carrying you, sometimes it's one or both, what happens is you bring it into every environment where you lead, and you end up infecting those environments with what's going on under the surface in you. Two quick examples from me. One time I was paged to the emergency room when I was a chaplain. A mum was on carpool in the minivan. This was back in the glorious days of the minivan before the SUV really took over. And her son and his friends had convinced her to not let them buckle up. They kind of ganged up on her and she gave in to them for whatever reason. She was wearing a seatbelt and the kids weren't. And you probably can imagine where the story is going. Someone ran a red light, T-boned her, and all 5 children are ejected out of the car, and she survives without a scratch because she's wearing a seatbelt. They're all rushed to the ER. I get paged to rush down, and I'm angry at this woman for not wearing a seatbelt, for not buckling up her kids. Because one of the things that goes on under the surface in my life is my family propaganda, my family of origin, the way I was raised, just like you too. And in the Cuss family, not wearing a seatbelt is 3 steps lower than being a serial killer. Like seriously, if I turned out to be a serial killer, which by the way, I'm not, and look, I can't guarantee the future. I'm not a Calvinist, but I don't think I'm going to fall into serial killing. It's very unlikely. But if by chance I did become a serial killer and my parents found out about it, their first question would be, was he wearing a seatbelt on the way to those murders? And if I was, then not so bad. I mean, I'm kind of making light here, but you'll be blown away at how your values, your unspoken values, get in the way of connecting with another human being. Now, in this particular case, all of these kids were fighting for their life. They did all make it, but some of them were in really bad shape. And this poor woman had to call all her friends, the mothers and the fathers of these boys, and explain to them that their son was in terrible shape and it was her fault. It was awful. But I was so busy judging her that I wasn't able to connect with her. It turns out you cannot judge another human being and connect with them at the same time. You have to choose. In fact, if you just want to look at 2024 as a general rule, this is functionally why social media doesn't work, is because we all move so quickly into judgment and self-righteousness, we disconnect. Another simple example would be I noticed after being a chaplain for 6 weeks, I had been married for 7 weeks, by the way. I did a 1 week honeymoon. And then my very first day on the job as a chaplain was the last day of my honeymoon. It was a 28-hour overnight shift. It was crazy. About 6 weeks into chaplaincy, I noticed that every time I went to the emergency room, I was praying 2 prayers. I was praying, please God, don't let it be my wife on that gurney. And please don't let it be anyone I know on that gurney. And then when I get down to the ER and I look at the gurney as it comes off the helicopter and it's not my wife and it's not anyone I know, then I pray a third prayer. Thank you, Jesus, that it is not anyone I know or my wife. Now, these prayers, there's nothing wrong with these prayers. They're very human prayers. If I was a chaplain today, I'd be praying those prayers today. But you can't connect to people in the worst moment of their life while you're busy throwing a party. I mean, I was one step from the Pharisee in Luke chapter 18, where the Pharisee says, thank you, God, I'm not like that person. When you just take a moment and you step off the speed and pace of ministry and you just look at what's going on under the surface of your life, you'd be blown away by everything that's just under your awareness. And that's my field. What I do and what we'll be doing in October, today is just a real brief taste, is I'll be helping you, and I'll do a little bit of this today. I'll be helping you go through a 3-step process. I'll put it on the screen for us, of learning how to notice and then name and then diffuse reactivity. Notice, name, and diffuse reactivity. First in you, always first in you, and then over time in your people. If your staff, your congregants, your key leaders, if you can learn to notice the triggers that make you reactive, make you unwell, make you anxious, if you can notice what you're carrying into a room, what others are carrying into a room, if you can pay attention, not just to the mission of ministry, but the context of ministry, not just what we're talking about, but the way we're relating, you can be a much more powerful leader. And my field is a particular kind of anxiety that's known as chronic anxiety. That's the clinical name for it. That's the anxiety I was trained in as a chaplain. It's the most common anxiety that leaders and parents carry, chronic anxiety. And so I just want to spend 10 minutes telling us what it is, and then giving us a couple of tools to help us notice it. By the way, on this 3-step journey of notice, name, and diffuse, we'll be going through that whole journey in October, but today we're just going to do notice. I'm not doing that as a tease. It's just that there's no real fast way to do this journey. So today, just for the 15, 20 minutes, just noticing, just learning to notice. But listen, even if you can just notice, just walking into a room and noticing, things like who's generating the anxiety, who's carrying the anxiety. Some of you, frankly, who are executive pastors, you have been spending a long time trying to wrangle your lead pastor and protect your staff from him. I've worked with a few executive pastors that are in that position. They've got one foot on the dock and one on the canoe, and they're constantly trying to bridge the gap between lead pastor and staff. You might just pause, and rather than catching the anxiety, which a lot of executive pastors do, executive pastors are prone to enmeshment, prone to over-functioning. And what you end up doing is you don't just pause and notice. If you just pay attention and say, who's generating the anxiety? Second question is, who's carrying the anxiety? And then the third fascinating question, what micro adjustments is everyone making to keep the situation unchanged? What micro adjustments? I used to have staff members that would be chronically late for meetings, and then they would act like they weren't late at all when they walked in, and it would make me so angry. I really value promptness. It's one of my core values. And a staff member would roll in 8 minutes or 12 minutes late and not apologize, not text courteously and let us know. And I'd find myself having such a massive overreaction. Sometimes that's the way you can locate your anxiety, is your overreaction to other people's behavior. Okay, so that was the problem. They're the one generating the anxiety. I was the one carrying it, but I tend to be a conflict avoider. It's not a good trait. I would say in my 28 years of leadership, the besetting sin of my leadership is the belief that if I give people enough time and space, they'll do the right thing. I used to think that was gracious. If I give people enough time and space, they'll do the right thing. Come to find out, that's not gracious. That's just me avoiding conflict. So even such a simple, silly thing like somebody coming in late chronically to meetings, if that's the problem, if they're generating it, then what micro adjustments are we doing? Well, we're all agreeing not to confront them about it. We're all agreeing just to keep our head down as business as usual. That's a simple example of chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety is one kind of anxiety that shows up like another kind of anxiety called acute anxiety. Now, look, there are 12 to 15 different kinds of anxiety. There's trauma, there's grief, there's bipolarity, there's depression that requires medication. If we just focus on two, chronic anxiety versus acute anxiety, let's talk about acute anxiety. Acute anxiety happens anytime you or a loved one might be in physical danger. Acute anxiety is always related to a physical threat to your body, your harm. So, if you've ever almost been in a car accident, you've experienced acute anxiety. I grew up in Western Australia. We have 9 of the 10 deadliest snakes in the world. Australia is a fantastic place to die. You can die on the land, you can die in the water. Like, you want to die? We can help you do that in Australia. And we'll be very friendly as we do. But in my backyard and my area where I grew up, there were several of these deadly snakes, but the two most common were the dugite and the tiger snake. Now, the dugite is kind of a light to mid brown, 6 or 7 feet long. It's really long. It is deadly. If you get bitten by dugite, you're in big trouble, but it's very shy. And so I've seen maybe a dozen dugites in my 20 years in Australia. Not a lot, but the only time I've ever seen a dugite is when it's slithering away from me. By the time you see it, it's already leaving the scene. But the tiger snake, which is also deadly, it was born mad. Like, it came out of the egg rumpy. The tiger snake will come after you, it'll have a go at you. When I was a teenager, my sister, my older sister, would make me walk ahead of her to school to flush out the deadly snakes. And one time I was walking to school and I heard a rustle on the leaves and I looked down and there's a tiger snake and he's coming at me. And I just ran and screamed as loud as I could. That's acute anxiety. You're familiar with acute anxiety. You get a big dose of adrenaline. Your brain gets really sharp, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't last very long, right? It's usually just seconds or a minute. If you've ever lost a child in a public space, that's acute anxiety. You drop everything, you rush to find your child. Leadership anxiety isn't generally acute. You're not actually in danger. It's chronic. And what's interesting about chronic anxiety is it's not a real threat. It's a false threat that feels real in the moment, or it's a false need that feels real in the moment. So a question I'm just going to leave with you that you can be thinking about or maybe having a little talk about with some folks is, what do you think you need that you don't really need? What do you think you need that you don't really need? Like, I need every sermon I've ever preached to be the best sermon you've ever heard. I used to come home from church. My wife's a preacher's kid. She was raised in the church. My father-in-law is a pastor. Lisa left her church, went to Bible college, Johnson University in Knoxville. That's where she and I met. Mandatory chapel at Johnson. We do 4 or 5 chapels a week. As far as I can tell, Lisa has listened to about 10,000 sermons in her life. I think we can agree that one more is not going to do the trick for her. But in the moment after I preach and I come home from church, I need her to not only love the sermon, I need her to be waiting for me like in lingerie. Like, she's gotten the kids and she's like, Steve, the Apostle Paul himself could not have constructed such a fine message. Let's consummate the sermon. We must consummate that sermon. That's my false need. After I preach, I have this weird false need to get all this approval. That would be a false need that feels like a real need. Some of you are people pleasers like me. Some of you need to be needed. Some of you need to be understood. Some of you need your people to get along with each other. You get along with everybody, but your people have fights and you anxiously go in and make a false peace. Some of you need to always be in control. Some of you always need to know the answer when someone asks a question. It's almost impossible for you to say, I don't know. Some of you are perfectionists. This is the realm of chronic anxiety. And chronic anxiety doesn't show up with a big dose of adrenaline like acute anxiety. It's more like an IV drip. It's more like a leader is just carrying an IV drip in their arm and 24/7 drip, drip, drip of adrenaline and hormones that get activated when your false needs are not being met. For me, this really came to a head with my critics. I have an anxious need to be understood. If you misunderstand me, I get anxious. I have an anxious need to be liked. If you are disappointed in me, if you don't like me, I get anxious. And so what ended up happening, like I'm not talking about garden variety critics that every church has. I'm talking about that committed band of brothers and sisters that get their kicks out of kicking the pastor. You know what I'm talking about? Every church has these. Even a healthy church, you always have a little committed band of people. For me, there were 6 of them. I called them my frequent flyers. I wanted to give them a punch card. Like, hey, every 10 visits, I get to punch you in the face. Like I've already tried to meet with you and resolve it. But these people, they weren't interested in understanding me. They were interested in kicking me around as the leader. But if I'm not aware of that, then I am incessantly trying to explain myself to them. And I'm living out of my reactivity instead of out of my well-being. So, a couple of interesting things about chronic anxiety. Number one, it's the only type of anxiety that's contagious. No other type of anxiety is contagious. Acute anxiety, life and death anxiety is not contagious. Trauma is not contagious. But chronic anxiety, leadership anxiety is contagious. And that's because it is generated by assumptions, expectations, false beliefs, and false needs. You and I, we all carry assumptions about ourselves, about God, about the world, about other people. And we all carry expectations that we place on each other. And it is through the transfer of expectation and assumption that chronic anxiety is spread. So, who on your staff is the most anxious person? This is not the person that has the most worry and fear. That's not what chronic anxiety looks like. Chronic anxiety doesn't look like worry and fear. It looks like reactivity. That's what chronic anxiety looks like. Who's your most reactive staff member? Sometimes reactivity can look like people getting really quiet. Have you ever seen that? Some people, they shut down when they're reactive. Sometimes reactivity can look like somebody dominating or getting angry or having to have the last word. And so what I do is I help organizational leaders notice the reactivity patterns and triggers, the assumptions and expectations in themselves and in their people. Because reactivity is contagious, it ends up forming stuck, predictable patterns in every group of people. Stuck, predictable patterns. Think about either your staff, or you could think about like an elder group. Let me ask you 3 questions. Who in that group of people that you're picturing always uses the most words in every meeting? Who never speaks up unless they're called upon? Who has their own secret meeting after the meeting? Who has their own secret meeting after the meeting? You've got 2 choices. You can focus on your agenda and your mission and let the anxiety spread wildly in your organization. Or you can do the freeing thing of walking into any environment and learning to notice the anxiety going around. And then over time, we'll do this in October, You can start to name what's going on, and then you can diffuse it. And what that does is it helps people go from reactive and disconnected back to connected, connected to themselves, connected to each other, where they can listen to learn rather than listening to defend and listening to fix. And maybe most powerfully, connected to God's presence. Because one of the things that chronic anxiety does is it blocks you from noticing God's presence. If we go back to that stuck, predictable pattern, right? I mentioned this in brief, and we'll get into this a bit more in October. But those of you who have ever tried to get a child out the door for school on time, you are very familiar with stuck, predictable patterns. Like, you start to think about it, every morning it's the same dance. It's the same playbook that you and your child are operating on to get your kid out the door. And yet somehow every morning you're surprised, you get kind of caught up in it. If instead you go into that environment and notice the anxiety, you're much less likely to catch it. So, Lee, let me hand back to you. Obviously,
Yeah.
today was just an idea. Let me throw some things on the board for you. I've got a couple more tools here if we want to get into them, but let's just pause and see where we want to go from here.
That's good. Love it. I had a couple things that I just jotted down, but I know that some of you guys listening, just getting kind of fire hosed with this topic. I think Brandon and some of the guys caves in the chat, so you guys can unmute. But Steve, one of the things that as I was sitting just listening to you, it feels like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but especially in leadership, would you agree that anxiety is a constant? Are we literally like, it's not something that we can just completely eliminate, but it's something that we have to learn to navigate? I'm not trying to be just elementary here, but I think sometimes we go, tell me how to get rid of all my anxiety, but it feels like it's a constant looming presence. Can you offer that up? And then maybe secondly, and maybe this is too deep of a rabbit trail to go down into, but like, I know some of us on this call, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I've talked to a number of guys, like, it feels like it's not only constant, but it's kind of crippling in many ways, right? And I think I'm referring to the chronic style that you mentioned earlier. So maybe just in a minute or two, can you briefly just kind of not fix us, but maybe reassure us of the reality of this stuff?
It's Lee, I'd say 2 for 2 golden questions. So, I find Andy Stanley to be phenomenal. And
He's
one
the
statement
Pope.
he said,
He's the Pope.
you have to
He's the
decide.
Pope.
He's incredible.
He's the
Uh,
Pope.
you have to decide, is this a problem to solve or a tension to manage? And anxiety is a tension to manage. So I love that you asked the question. When I published my book, the publisher pushed back on me hard, and they said, you need to guarantee to eliminate anxiety by the end of the book. And I'm like, what are you, nuts? It's called managing. So you've got 2 choices in life. You can be managed by it, or you can manage it, but it's going to exist either way. The managing it is how I survived chaplaincy. So if you think about the life of a hospital chaplain, no one in a hospital is sitting around saying, hey, life's pretty good. We're kind of bored. Let's call the chaplain. He's a good time. The whole job, dozens of times a day, is high intensity, worst moments of people's life. So managing anxiety increases your capacity for chaos, but it also, and I think this is the most powerful side, so the crippling part of it, it gives you a path to not be defeated by it. So like, I tried to give in to my critics for years, but one of the tools we'll cover in October is, how do you figure out who's generating the anxiety and how do you make them carry it so you're not carrying it?
Mm.
And that's one of the most powerful things you can do as a leader. So like, people, I'm a preacher, people come down and everybody has an opinion on a sermon. I'm aware that I'm a people pleaser, so I'm managing that. But rather than like listening to people's stupid ideas on how I should preach, I just put the anxiety right back on them. I don't do it vindictively or in a mean way, but very clear. So another example would be, I often meet with people in my church that want Awanas. They want our church to start an Awanas. I actually don't know anything about Awanas, but we're never going to do one. And old me would have listened, had a meeting, tell me more. But now I just very kindly say, oh, I'm so glad Awanas really helped you, but no, we'll never do that here. And I've even had some people say, well, will you pray about it? Oh, no, we don't need to pray about that. Thanks for asking. Now, I'm not being
Oh.
mean. I'm not
Steve,
being, I'm
all
just
the
being,
Awana people on the call are really upset at you right now. Like,
oh, they can be upset.
There's so many of them too.
I'll
it
just
really
say,
is.
if Awanas helps you, I'm thrilled for you. But also, I have noticed, man, Awanas generates militant mothers.
Yes.
Woof. So, so just the idea of how do you help somebody carry their anxiety? A lot of church people are
Josh
putting
Merrill
their
just
anxiety.
lost his mind. It's great.
That's it. I'll stop there and see where you
No,
want
it's
to go.
great. No, that's great. I think what's interesting is the fact that I just jotted down as you were talking. I have people on my team, and I've probably been guilty of it. And then I'll let some other people jump in. You can unmute. But I think I have some people on our team that actually leverage anxiety as a way of
Yep.
uh projecting leadership, right? They're creating crisis all the time when there isn't one. So they're always running around anxious, right? It's kind of that old Seinfeld episode where George says, just look busy, or you just go, I'm always busy, and I feel like I've got a little bit of that at times that leaks into our team, that like
Yep.
the need to show anxiety because it tends to, in their false assumption is it portrays, I don't know, value, all
Yep.
of those sorts of things. So I'm going to open
Yep.
it up. I'm going to open it up for people on the call. Don't want to hog. Please unmute and throw your questions at Steve. Go. Not about Awanas, just about anxiety.
Steve, I read your book last year, and I just thought it was just so helpful, especially with the chapter of the tools that you needed to be able to manage this anxiety. And so I just remember like underlining several different aspects of it, like the workloads scrub to the listening to defend, and then when you just hinted of the gift of the last word. And so I just remember like underlining this, like someone must have the last word. It no longer must be me. I will be okay without the last word, which means that I'm okay being misunderstood. I
Yeah.
reject the fallacy that one response from me is what will be needed to move on. You get the final say, and I will sit here being misunderstood, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And like it's like, man, so my question to you would be, how do you get there? Right? Like, because all of us as leaders, like we do have this tendency is it's like, okay, we need to say the last word, or we don't want to be misunderstood in this kind of context or whatever it means. So just maybe something practical for the
Yeah.
team.
It's very helpful to know your own triggers. And one of mine is the need to be understood. I find Jesus to be stunning in that he was able to stand in front of Pontius Pilate and be willfully and militantly misunderstood and not need to explain himself. So that is that's a great example of a connected, differentiated presence. But what you're looking for, like one of the things that I didn't do today, because I really didn't want to like overwhelm us. And so this is maybe a little more deep that we can get into in October. I'll throw it on the screen though. Once you notice these predictable patterns, you can start paying attention to your attempted solutions. So if anxiety forms predictable patterns between any group of people, like those of you who are married, whatever you fight about changes, the topic changes, sex, money, raising the kids, whatever you fight about. But the pattern of your fight is usually the same. You and your spouse probably fight in predictable ways. One of you starts it, the other one escalates. I don't know what it is for you, but you probably have a very predictable dance with your spouse. But part of what keeps patterns predictable is my attempted solution to solve the problem. So my attempted solution is the problem. So I'll give you a simple example, then I'll talk about being understood. When my son came home from basketball practice, he was complaining as a teenager. He's like, Dad, William's a ball hog. William never passes the ball. All right, that's the problem. I said to Andrew, well, what are you doing about it? Andrew said, well, if William's not going to pass the ball to me, you know what he said, I'm not passing the ball to William. Andrew's solution is an attempted solution. Andrew's solution of not passing the ball to William is now the predictable pattern. Does that make sense? This is a bit of a mindset shift, but even as leaders, if you stop focusing on problems and all you did was start noticing everyone's attempted solutions to those problems. That's a game changer. It's a game changer in leadership. And what you're looking for in your attempted solutions is anytime you're applying more of the same or try harder to something that's not working. And that's what I was doing with my critics. My critics are misunderstanding me. I know I have a need to be understood. I'm getting triggered. And I just kept meeting with them. And when they wouldn't understand me, I tried harder to explain myself in the meeting. And when they wouldn't understand, I did more meetings. And once you realize that anxiety has you on a treadmill to nowhere, that will really motivate you to change. And so, yes, what you quoted, Kay, in the book, as I listened to you say it, I'm like, man, I kind of sound smarmy. I didn't say that to those people. That was more for my readers as my mental process. But I have sat down with my hostile critics and said, I want you to know I'm done explaining myself to you. You've lost the right to my insight. We've met 7 times now. 2 times ago, I told you how much your criticism and your slander of me hurts. I told you how much I'm feeling bullied by you, and that didn't change your behavior. I actually gave you the gift of my vulnerability, and you bullied me with my vulnerability. That tells me everything I need to know about you. So I will meet with you to learn what you want to say, and I'll always have an elder present to bear witness, but I'm not explaining myself to you anymore. That would be an example of breaking the attempted solution and also putting the anxiety back where it belongs.
Anybody else want to jump in? We got some time. Don't be shy. You guys never are.
Listen, I like to fly fish and I like to play guitar. The more I work with my critics, the more time I'm now freed up to do my hobbies. Let's just purely pragmatically, the reason to manage anxiety is free time. I'm kind of being tongue in cheek, but hopefully that helps.
Steve, this is Garrison. It's an honor to speak with you. I've read all your books, and my wife is even a bigger fan of you than I am. So she's actually on the call too. I sent her the link, so she's on. But you said connected, differentiated presence, and then you open with saying you can't judge and connect at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm working this out. Like, how do you have to, when you have subordinates and you're judging their performance, but yet you still want to connect with them. I'm still figuring this out. I haven't yet, but I'm curious to see how, if you could just explain that for me. Yeah.
When people with chronic anxiety, this anxiety that's driven by something false, not by something true. So just go back and car accidents and snake attacks, then that's true, that's acute anxiety. But leaders and people, conflict happens because we get wrapped up in something false. What happens to us is we're no longer human-sized. We either get bigger than human-sized or smaller. That's why some people in your staff, when they get reactive, they amp up. They get more domineering, a bit more aggressive. They have to have the last word. Your stereotypical dad with his middle school daughter, when her crush has broken up with her and she's devastated, and the dad's like, plenty more fish in the sea. That's an example of the dad getting bigger. He's trying to shrink your problem down to a simple fix. So some of us, that our spouses have said, look, stop trying to give me advice. I'm just trying to tell you about my day. What's going on there is we are getting anxious listening to your day. We have a need to listen to fix instead of listen to connect. Stuff like this. That's bigger, but smaller. What happens is when we get bigger, we've moved into self-righteousness. So we're no longer human-sized. We're no longer depending on the goodness of God. We're now depending on ourselves to be well. When we get smaller, we've moved into self-protection or self-pity. I think that was what Lee was maybe proposing with some of these anxious staff members that are like, look at everything I'm always doing. You've probably worked with somebody that needs an incessant amount of encouragement. That's because they're anxious and they're moving into self-pity, and they always need assurance and reinforcement and encouragement, more than you could ever possibly give. It's like they're a black hole of emotional need. What you're talking about, Harrison, is judging. That sounds different to me. If you're doing a performance review, that sounds very healthy and human to me. But with that lady, like the lady in the emergency room, she was just in a horrific car accident with her son and 4 of his friends fighting for their life. And I'm so busy condemning her in my head that I have no connection for her. Like, what is wrong with me? And so you can't really stop the way we judge each other. What you can stop is letting judgment have the last word. So I had to do my own internal work. I had to be well. I had to notice what was going on in me so I could die to that, give it to God, repent of it. And now I'm free of judgment and I can connect to this woman in the worst moment of her life. But doing a performance review to me doesn't sound like, I'm talking about judgmentalism, but what you're describing sounds very healthy to me, to give somebody, that sounds like a kindness, to review their performance, give them clear feedback. That doesn't sound anxious to me.
That's awesome. Steve, question for you here. You're bringing up just the awareness of the chronic anxiety, the leadership anxiety. Obviously, in your book, as well as in October at Think Tank, you'll be talking about actionable steps, how to mitigate, how to manage. I loved your quote. You can either manage it or it's going to manage you. But there's kind of like a middle ground of creating the margin and the patterns and the habits to begin to take the steps to action. Is there anything you would encourage us in that in-between space between awareness and action, just to create the margin to realize some of this? Does that make sense? I'm just talking about that space in between. Would love for you to dive into that for a second.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jeff, I'm very aware that this is a brief thing, but every one of us, as a general rule, ministry attracts others-focused people, personality types. We like to focus on others or mission. And then for some of us, it's both. So I'm type A, entrepreneurial, driven. I love a big vision and mission, and I really enjoy focusing on others. That's stereotypically what churches tend to attract in staff. That means that what's the church word for it? We suck. That's the church word for it. We all suck at paying attention to ourselves. So Bernard of Clairvaux, the early church father, he told ministers, this is like in 400, 500 AD, he said, don't be more generous than God is. So I think what we need to do is spend more of our time enjoying the gifts of God that God has given us that we can't give to our people. So Lee laid some of it out in October. Like, I know Lee and Kay have intentionally created an experience where there's life-giving relational time. There's some indulgence or abundance, great food, free time, recreation. So you can actually go on my website. You can go to stevecuswords.com and you can download a life-giving list. We give you a spreadsheet, we give you a video. And what a life-giving list is can you develop a list of gifts that God has given you where you are stubbing your toe on the love of God 8 to 12 times a day? And so these are often micro habits, things that take 1 minute to 5 minutes. So I try to live a life where I am thanking God for God's good gifts and God's goodness 8 to 12 times a day. And it's not just the typical spiritual disciplines, which I do practice, but it's also silly things like rubbing my dog's ears. This morning, I listened to a Springsteen album from start to finish. Like God has created humans to notice beauty, and music to me is really moving. So I try to listen to music every day. I don't want to get too graphic with you, but my wife and I held each other this morning before I got out of bed. That's on my life-giving list. My wife's all over my life-giving list in some quite explicit ways and then some just very general ways. But when we're holding each other, or when I'm rubbing my dog's ears, or when I'm listening to Springsteen, or when I'm reading Romans chapter 7, which I read this morning, I'm giving thanks for the gift of this in my life. And I'm just trying to receive from God, because we are too generous as pastors. We give too much away. and we don't receive for ourselves. If you had a kid and every birthday and Christmas, you gave them gifts as their parent and they gave them away to someone in need, like every time you gave them a gift for your birthday and Christmas, they wanted you to drive them down to the rescue mission to give the gifts to some kid in need. Now, I know that our churches would make a freaking video testimonial about that kid, but that's sick behavior. That's not healthy. Your kid gives some of their gifts away. Of course, that's incredible. But every time you give your kid this gift, they give it away, they don't even unwrap it. A lot of pastors have that problem. We give and we give and we give and we give, and we end up running dry. So the simplest thing that you can do between now and October is enjoy the goodness of God 8 to 12 times a day. It only takes minutes. I have 160 items on my life-giving list. I'm never at a loss of what to do in the day that takes just a few minutes where I remember the Lord. Now, I made that sound more, I don't always do it every day. Sometimes I forget, but I try to cultivate that habit, and I have dozens and dozens, over 100 things.
It's amazing. Thanks for answering that, Steve.
We just have a few minutes, Steve, and I wanted to get we're teeing you up to not be able to adequately answer. So let's just acknowledge that, right? Hey, 30 seconds, answer this deep question. But Sean was asking in the chat around, the personal anxiety, some of those methodologies around managing anxiety, but he was asking specifically, I'll just read it, right? Love to hear any of your thoughts on managing corporate or cultural anxiety in the organization, as opposed to just simply personal anxiety, and how some system stuff can maybe help in bringing help to the family system. So Sean, if you're on here, you can clarify that if you want. But that was what Sean put in the chat, which I thought was good.
No, you nailed it, Lee. And Steve, like, that's when you feel it in the room, if you're in a good space.
Yeah.
And what you do to bring health back to people.
Yep. Good. So some of what I covered today is systemic. You walk into any room, who's the most anxious person in the room? How do I know I'm catching the anxiety? So just some of that noticing it can really be a game changer. Our worship leader, he noticed how 2 musicians always change the mood of the band in rehearsal. One by being chronically late, and one by being kind of an Eeyore, like he would come in, everyone was kind of laughing around in the rehearsal as they're plugging in their instruments, and then the Eeyore would walk in, and the room got cold. And then the worship leader would get so frustrated. All he did for 3 weeks was notice it and notice what was going on in him. So that's where I would start. But once you've identified the predictable recurring pattern, and then once you're clear on your attempted solutions, the next step is to figure out who's the motivated change agents. So who else in this group wants things to be different than the way they are now? Typically, as a general rule, the most anxious person, or the one generating the anxiety, wants it to stay the same. And when you and your motivated change agents try to change it, they will sabotage change. So you have to have, in the words of Ed Freeman, he says the problem with leadership is a failure of nerve. You have to have enough nerve to push through the resistance and sabotage to get to a new reality. That's about as much as I can say in a couple of minutes. This is a longer journey for sure.
That's really good.
But I will just say the most surprising thing for a leader is just working on yourself changes the system. So what we do in our church is we expect every staff member to take responsibility for their own anxiety. And just working on yourself is the fastest path to making a healthy system. And then if you have motivated change agents, man, helping everyone do it. Lee, I can send this in the chat if you want. We have an 8-week workbook with videos for any staff that just want to go through this together.
Great, for sure.
Yeah,
I'll
send it to Lee if you want to send it out.
No,
Lee.
you can, or you can drop it in the chat right now as I
I'll
kind
do
of
that.
wrap us, and then we'll also include it in our follow-up email that's going to go out tonight.
Great.
So Steve, seriously, bro, thank you. And I apologize again that it happens on all these calls. So it's typical of these calls, the good ones anyway, where we have way too much to cover and way little time to do it. But again, the advantage is we'll get more of this when we come together. And again, those of you that have been a part of Think Tank Live, it's still going to have all of the same values that we have established over the last 4 years, but we are tweaking it a little bit this year. So there is going to be, I don't know what Steve said. I have to go back to the recording, but when he mentioned Think Tank Live, he said something like abundance and reflection or something. I'm like, yes, that we want to balance you guys experiencing that while also, having a chance to release some of that anxiety through replenishment. So, Steve will be here, and as well, we're gonna interweave, so we won't completely be anxious the entire time we're together. We're gonna interweave Steve guiding us through that with some other content in the same lane, really trying to help you guys be sustainable. And that's really what we always come back to. And it sounds sort of cliche, but when we talk to our Grow Minute team, so I was like, how do we help ministry leaders sustain and provide longevity? And so that's going to be a lot of the content of the Thursday of Think Tank Live, to just help you guys stay in the game, because we think you guys are phenomenal leaders and we need the church to have it. So that code, Steve put that in there, his stevecusswords.com. You can go to his website and get that and order books, as well as that code for the early bird. A lot of you have signed up already as we've been on the call, but that'll stay live for about 72 hours. So you can hit that and then make sure that you'll get some more information on that. Okay, guys, appreciate it. Appreciate you guys being here. Steve, thank you again. We look forward to hanging out with you in October. And I think that's it. Okay, anything? Good.
Yep. No, if you guys have any problems with the registration or anything like that,